Hey guys, today we are talking about fermentation. So to start, what I'm going to do is I'm going to squeeze this tennis ball. And when I squeeze this tennis ball, I am using energy, right? So there's sugar in my blood, and that sugar goes into my cells. And we know that um, our cells can't really use sugar. It has to change it into ATP. So my cells in my hand are taking that sugar, the C6H12O6, and just as a review, that sugar is going to go through glycolysis right outside the mitochondria. So here's our mitochondria, and we're not inside of it. We are outside of the mitochondria doing glycolysis. And we break down that sugar, or we lyse it, we break it in half into two 3-carbon molecules called pyruvate. Then that pyruvate goes into the mitochondria. And there we take a deep breath, and the oxygen in your blood is going to attach onto those carbons, and that makes carbon dioxide, and that carbon dioxide leaves the mitochondria, leaves the cell, travels through your blood, and goes into your lungs, and you breathe it out. And then we have hydrogens and oxygens, and so those oxygens attach onto the hydrogens, and it makes water, H2O, and that water leaves the mitochondria, leaves the cell, goes into your blood, travels up to your lungs, and you breathe it out. And so in this process, you've made 32 ATP, or I've made 32 ATP so that I can squeeze this ball. I'm taking the sugar, converting it into ATP so that I can do this. However, if I do this really fast and I keep doing this, I'm going to use up all of my ATP. I'm going to use up all my ATP, so I have to keep making ATP. I'm going through cell respiration, and then I'm going to eventually run out of oxygen. So right here, I'm going to run out of oxygen because we use oxygen to break down the glucose. And so when we run out of oxygen, it becomes an anaerobic process. So remember that cell respiration is aerobic, meaning it requires oxygen. So here's the oxygen going in. And so if I used all my oxygen up and my blood can't bring enough oxygen to my cells fast enough because I'm making ATP so quickly, then it becomes anaerobic, or absence of oxygen. And so when we have an absence of oxygen, so an animal like myself, and sometimes microbes like yeast or bacteria, they're going to go through a process called fermentation. And so this happens instead of cell respiration in the absence of oxygen. So we take that sugar, the 6-carbon molecule, and we are going to need to make ATP to fuel the squeezing. And so we go through glycolysis. We know that glycolysis doesn't happen in the mitochondria. And we break it down. We rupture it into two 3-carbon molecules called pyruvate. And instead of going into the mitochondria and going through cell respiration, it's going to go through a process called fermentation. And so animals are going to go through a type of fermentation called lactic acid fermentation. And if you've ever run really hard one day or worked out and your legs are all sore, that's because there's lactic acid buildup. While you were working out, you didn't have enough oxygen in all of your muscles all the time, so you had to go into fermentation. And during fermentation in animals, lactic acid is a byproduct. It's an extra, like oxygen in photosynthesis. It's just extra. It's created. And so when you go through, so here I'm squeezing, and I'm using up all my ATP, and I'm using up all my oxygen, and I need to make more ATP, and I don't have any oxygen, so I'm starting to go into fermentation. How do I know I'm going into fermentation? Because my hand is cramping up. My hand is cramping up because it's making lactic acid. All my cells are making lactic acid right now because they have to go into this fermentation. It is a backup in our muscle cells or in our animal cells. It's a backup. And so why is it a backup? Well, it's a backup because it makes only 2 ATP. So here in cell respiration, we make 32 ATP for one molecule of glucose. However, in fermentation, we make only 2 ATP. ATP. And so it's not as efficient. Let's make our our energy sign here, kablam sign. So it's not as efficient, but it's better than cell death. So our cells go into fermentation instead of dying. So it produces less ATP, but it keeps the cell going. However, it's depositing that lactic acid into your muscles so that your muscles stop, so that it tells you to stop working because your body can't make enough ATP to keep going. So your muscles stop working. It cramps up. So that's what happens if you're an animal. You go through lactic acid fermentation. However, if you're a fungi, which is a yeast is a type of fungi, it's a single-celled fungus, or lots of bacteria are going to go through what we call alcohol fermentation. So in alcohol fermentation, it's just another form of fermentation. It's just different types of organisms are doing it differently. The byproducts are going to be carbon dioxide and alcohol. So the byproducts, the extra, the leftover. So the fungi are going to be in an area where there's no oxygen. So sometimes if you've ever stepped in mud that smells really bad, it's anaerobic mud and there's no oxygen, so it's going through a fermentation process and it's producing smelly chemicals or smelly chemicals. And so it's anaerobic and it's fermenting, or it's going through fermentation. And so certain types of fungus are going to produce alcohol and carbon dioxide. And this is how we get, here let me draw, let's see if I can draw a bottle of wine. I am no artist here. If we have a bottle of wine here, this is just the top of the bottle. And so wine is simply fermented grapes. What we do is we put grape juice, or we crush grapes, and then we put the yeast inside of here. So it's just a single-celled fungus. This is stuff that we make bread with. We put the yeast in with the grape juice, and it's going to eat the sugars. So here's our sugar. It's going to eat the sugars in the grape juice. And it's going to, if we left the cap open, it would just go through cell respiration. They would just go through cell respiration. However, what we're going to do is we're going to put a cover on here, and there's no oxygen coming in. And so we've made it an anaerobic environment. So there's no oxygen. So instead of going through cell respiration, we're going to go into our backup and go through fermentation. And so the yeast are going to ferment the grape juice. And they're going to survive as long as they can, and eating the grape juice and fermenting instead of cell respiration, producing alcohol and CO2 as a byproduct. And so this is what happens when we make beer. Beer is fermented barley, and hard cider, an alcoholic cider, is just fermented apple juice. It's just this process. We put yeast and it eats the sugar. The yeast eats the sugar and creates this alcohol byproduct. And so this is fermentation. And so this is what's happening when I squeeze this ball. I'm going to use up all of my ATP and eventually go into my backup and ferment. But instead of creating alcohol, I create lactic acid. So that is our notes for fermentation. I hope this helps.